Welcome to St. Miracle Channel. Today we're diving deep into the life of St. Ignatius of Loyola. You probably know him as the founder of the Jesuits, but we're going beyond the basics today. We're going to uncover a surprising connection to mothers and childbirth.
Yeah, a connection that goes beyond, his role as a spiritual figure. We're going to be talking about actual miracles. Miracles attributed to St. Ignatius, specifically helping women in childbirth, often in situations that seem impossible.
So let's rewind a bit first. Ignatius, he wasn't always a saint, right? He started as a knight, full of ambition, worldly desires.
Exactly. It took a pretty life-changing event to set him on this new path. I'm talking about the Battle of Pamplona, of course, where he was severely injured by a cannonball, led to a long and painful recovery.
And it's during this recovery that we see a huge shift in his perspective. He couldn't really continue his knightly activities, so he turned to reading. But instead of tales of chivalry, what he expected, he gets engrossed in the lives of saints.
Yeah, it's almost as if that injury forced him to confront, his own mortality, made him reevaluate what was important. And that fascination with these saints, it sparked a spiritual awakening, a turning point that would ultimately lead him to renounce his former life and dedicate himself to something bigger.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The cannonball injury, it left him with a leg that didn't heal properly.
And Ignatius, being the proud man he was, decided to have the bone rebroken and set again.
All because he was worried about how it would look in his courtier's tights. Can you imagine the sheer determination, maybe a little vanity, to endure that pain just for appearances?
It shows how even as he's going through this spiritual journey, right, Ignatius is still dealing with worldly concerns. Highlights this human side to the soon-to-be saint, reminds us that transformation, it's a process, not some sudden overnight change.
So we have this fiery knight, right, injured in battle, undergoing this spiritual awakening. But that fiery nature doesn't completely disappear. There's this amazing story, almost a murder, avoided thanks to a donkey.
Ah, yes, the donkey's decision. It's such a great illustration of this inner conflict that Ignatius felt between his old impulses and his growing commitment to a life guided by, faith and reason.
So picture this. Ignatius riding his donkey, furious. He'd heard someone supposedly insult the Virgin Mary. He was enraged, determined to kill the offender.
But instead of taking matters into his own hands, he does something really unexpected. Decides to let the donkey choose the path, like surrendering his decision to a higher power, trusting fate, maybe divine providence to guide him.
And what happens? The donkey chooses the path leading away from his intended victim. It's almost like the donkey itself intervened, steered Ignatius away from a grave sin.
This story, even if it's maybe apocryphal, it reveals something crucial about Ignatius's spiritual development. His struggle to control his passions, to submit to a higher authority, whether it's God or the surprising wisdom of a donkey.
And this struggle, it's what led him to develop the spiritual exercises, that set of meditations, prayers, contemplative practices, designed to help people figure out God's will.
The spiritual exercises, still used today in retreats and spiritual direction, offering a really structured way to examine your conscience, confront your deepest desires, and ultimately find a path to greater spiritual freedom.
Pretty incredible that this personal journey of transformation led to something so lasting and influential.
And the journey didn't end there. Ignatius went on to found the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits.
Now, most people know about the Jesuits, but they might not know the unique context of their emergence. This was a time of huge religious upheaval, the Protestant Reformation challenging the Catholic Church's authority.
And the Jesuits, they were right at the forefront of the Catholic response. They became known for their missionary work, their rigorous educational institutions, and their unwavering loyalty to the Pope.
Which brings us to a maybe lesser-known aspect of Ignatius's legacy, his association with miracles, especially those connected to childbirth.
Yeah, it's interesting how this specific reputation developed. Even before his official canonization, there were these stories about his miraculous intervention in difficult births.
And these weren't just vague rumors. We have detailed accounts, specific cases, where families attributed successful births to the intercession of St. Ignatius.
What's especially fascinating is the use of what we might call scribal relics. Handwritten letters, even just the signature of Ignatius.
It might sound odd to us now, but back then, people truly believed that even the written word of a saint held a special power, some kind of spiritual energy that could impact the physical world.
This belief was rooted in the idea that a person's name had this almost mystical connection to their essence. So, a handwritten signature, it wasn't just ink on paper, it was a tangible link to the saint's presence. and power.
And these scribal relics were used in incredible ways. We have stories from across the globe, tiny villages to huge cities, where people claim that Ignatius had intervened, saving mothers and babies from seemingly hopeless situations.
Let's dive into a few of these incredible stories, starting with one of the earliest recorded miracles, 1594, a small town in what is now Slovakia.
A woman in labor.
Hmm.
For 3 days, the situation was dire. Both the mother and child's lives were at risk. And then a Jesuit priest arrives.
And this priest, he hears about this woman's terrible situation, takes a piece of clothing that had belonged to Ignatius, and places it on her chest.
Wow, it's like something out of a movie.
Right.
The tension, the worry, and then this simple act of faith. What happened next?
Well, the baby was born, healthy. The mother, she recovered. And the family, so grateful, they named their son Georgius Ignatius, a clear sign, they thought, of divine intervention, proof of the power of St. Ignatius.
It's amazing, and this story is just one of many. We find similar accounts from all over Palma de Mallorca, Vienna, Cologne, even places as far away as Nagasaki.
It's not just the geographical spread that's impressive. These stories come from different communities, social classes, even different religious backgrounds. The belief in Ignatius's power, it seems to go beyond any traditional boundaries.
Let's look at another really interesting story, one that highlights the personal impact of these miracles. This one takes us to Murcia, Spain. A woman named Catalina de Moratalla facing a very dangerous childbirth.
Catalina, she was hemorrhaging, the outlook was grim, but then a Jesuit priest comes in, having heard about her situation. He brought a signature of Ignatius with him.
The signature, that's all.
I know it might seem hard to believe now, but back then, the written word, especially the name of a saint, it held a deep spiritual significance, seen as this direct link to the saint, their presence, their power.
So this priest used the signature, praying for Ignatius's help, applying the signature to Catalina.
And incredibly, the bleeding stopped. Catalina gave birth to a healthy son. Full of gratitude, they named him Ignacio, after the saint who'd saved them.
These stories aren't just abstract events from the past, right? They're about real people, real fears, finding comfort in their faith.
Absolutely. And these stories, they offer us this window into people's lives back then. Their beliefs, their worries. They show us how faith was woven into everyday life, offering comfort and hope when times were uncertain.
You know, it's interesting how these stories spread so quickly and widely, like their own version of going viral, centuries before the internet. How did that happen?
That's a good question. And it shows how important networks and communication are in shaping beliefs, spreading information. The Jesuit network itself was crucial in sharing these stories about Ignatius.
The Jesuits, they were known for their record-keeping, their global reach, their dedication to promoting Ignatius's legacy.
Yeah, they had this complex communication system with letters and reports going between their missions and colleges all over the world. News of a miracle could spread rapidly through these channels.
Like an early modern news network,
Yeah,
but with a spiritual focus.
exactly. And it wasn't just passively recording these events either. The Jesuits, they actively promoted the veneration of Ignatius, especially as they were pushing for his canonization.
These miracle stories, especially those about childbirth, they were powerful tools to build up this cult of sainthood around Ignatius.
They proved his ability to intervene in even ordinary yet life-altering events, reinforcing the belief in his divine favor, strengthening his reputation as a powerful intercessor.
But the spread of these stories wasn't limited to the Jesuits, right? It was word of mouth, sermons, even artwork depicting these miracles, all helped to shape how people saw him.
It was a multi-pronged effort. And it's important to remember, this was a period of intense religious change. The Protestant Reformation challenging Catholic beliefs. The spread of these stories can be seen as a response to that uncertainty.
A way for people to reaffirm their faith, find comfort amidst change, and cling to that hope of divine intervention.
And it's fascinating how these stories often show ordinary people overcoming extraordinary things. This would have resonated with people for whom life was often so uncertain, reminding them that even in the darkest times, miracles were possible.
Speaking of precariousness, let's talk about the physical relics for a moment. If these handwritten items were so powerful and sought after, how did they end up in the hands of, say, a baker's wife in Eras or indigenous women in Michoacan?
That's where things get really interesting. There seems to have been a certain flexibility, maybe even informality, in how these relics were used and moved around.
So not always a top-down hierarchical system, more like a grassroots movement, with people sharing and distributing these relics within their own communities as needed.
Exactly. Remember, becoming a saint officially was slow and often political. But the need for help from above, that was immediate, constant. So people found their own ways to access Ignatius's power through these more informal channels.
Makes you wonder if there was tension between the official, sanctioned use of relics and these more everyday, even subversive practices. Were there arguments about who had the right to use them or how they should be handled?
Those are great questions, and they're still being debated by historians. It's likely that the use of these relics wasn't always so clear-cut. There was probably a whole spectrum of practices, from very ritualized to much more spontaneous, reflecting the different ways people thought to connect with the sacred.
It reminds us that faith and belief, they're not static. They're always evolving and adapting in response to changing situations, individual needs.
And with Ignatius, it seems his power, as the people saw it, went beyond official doctrine and formal processes.
It's remarkable to think that something as simple as a signature, a piece of clothing, could become such potent symbols of faith and hope. Makes you think about the nature of relics themselves, why they were so important to people in the past.
That's a question that's fascinated people for ages. What is it about something that belonged to or was touched by a holy person that makes it so special, so imbued with a sense of the sacred?
I mean, it's not like the object itself changes, right? It's the meaning, the stories, the beliefs that give it power.
Exactly. Relics, they're this tangible link to the past, to a person, an event, something with deep religious significance, offering a connection to the sacred across time and space.
And for those childbirth miracles, that connection must have been so comforting, like a piece of the saint with you
Yeah.
in your moment of need, of a physical, a manifestation of their presence and power.
You have to remember, childbirth, it was this liminal experience, right? This transition, life and death, where those boundaries, the physical and the spiritual, felt so close.
So having that relic linked to a holy person would have been reassuring, not being alone,
Yeah.
like a spiritual guardian watching over you.
Exactly. And back then, infant mortality, maternal mortality, it was all so high. Childbirth was dangerous.
Hmm.
Any comfort, any hope of divine help, people would grab onto it.
It makes those stories even more, powerful. The desperation, the faith people put in these relics, and then the relief when it worked, really human emotion.
And it wasn't just the, uneducated or superstitious who believed. We have accounts of well-educated people, even royalty, turning to relics for help. It was ingrained in the culture, part of how they saw the world.
So it's more complex than just blind faith. It's belief, experience, cultural norms, all mixed together, shaping how people related to the sacred.
That's a great point. These relics and stories, they give us a look into a worldview that's so different from ours, where the supernatural wasn't separate from everyday life, it was woven in.
And the fact that these stories continued, spread, even when people were skeptical or religion was changing, it shows they filled a need, a deep need.
It speaks to our desire for meaning, for purpose, for some kind of order when the world feels chaotic. And these stories, with their divine intervention, miraculous transformations, they offer that, a glimpse of order, hope, even in darkness.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into St. Ignatius of Loyola, what do you think is the biggest takeaway for us today? What can we learn from his story and those who sought his help centuries ago?
Maybe it's a reminder, even in our world, driven by reason and logic, there's still room for faith, for hope, belief in something bigger than us.
And that even the smallest things, a handwritten word, a piece of fabric, can hold so much power, connecting us to this long history of faith, of resilience, still inspiring us today.
It's a reminder that we can change, choose a different path. Our biggest challenges can become, chances for growth. Ignatius's life, it was full of these shifts, from worldly ambition to this deep spirituality. And that's what fueled his impact, the Jesuits, the spiritual exercises, still guiding people today.
His story shows us change is possible. We can choose a different way. And even when things are hard, there's meaning, purpose, hope. It's a message that goes beyond time and place, offering hope for anyone searching for meaning in their own life. And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the life of St. Ignatius of Loyola. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little inspiring.